Every Assassin's Creed game is about a secret war that's been going on through history between a side that thinks that they know everything and they should be the ones in charge, and a side that thinks free will is the greatest thing there is. But each one of the games say something slightly different with this. Let's see how fast I could go over them all. If you're trying to make society better, you have to listen to the people on the ground, not just decide what you think is better. It's not enough to have freedom of choice unless you have the information to make an educated choice. Leading with kindness rather than fear creates a stronger foundation to build something upon. Learn from the stories you take in, but eventually you gotta go off and tell your own story. Whatever ideals start a new society will always be corrupted by the people who just are out for their own power. The one telling the story can twist history to their own means. Fighting for just your own freedom isn't enough. It won't lead to great things, but fighting for everyone's freedom, that's something worth fighting for. Any group, if pushed too far in one direction, will end up being kind of shitty, and there's always going to be an example of somebody who goes against it. It's important to let ideals evolve rather than being trapped in traditional ways. It's not enough to just destroy the bad things in society. You have to be there to pick up the pieces and build something better. Finding the reasons we fight for a better world. Regardless of where you came from, regardless of who you were told to be, find a way to tell your own story. It's only in understanding the past that we could come to break some cycles. And right now we're ending with something that's perfect to bookend with where we began, the idea that if you see yourself above everybody, as more important than everybody, it could lead you down some dark roads. I want to talk about those investigation missions from the original Assassin's Creed and what they come to mean for the themes of the game. For anyone who may not remember, because this is an older game at this point, the vast majority of Assassin's Creed is made up of Altair going to a city, doing a bunch of investigations that include eavesdropping on citizens, pickpocketing citizens, interrogating citizens, or helping out an informant who's been in this area for a while and could give you some information. Altair starts this game as a very particular kind of prick.
Nothing is true. Everything is permitted. Understand these words. It matters not how we complete our task, only that it's done.
But this is not the way
My way is better.
He's somebody who, when given a mission, he believes he could do it better than anyone else. And it doesn't matter what the rules are or what anyone else says, he's just gonna get it done. Because this goes so horribly wrong in the first mission of the game, he is stripped of his rank and his tools. He is forced to not only go on a bunch of missions to perform assassinations, but to do all the investigating himself. As the game goes on, Altair becomes more and more okay with doing these investigations. And not only that, is asking a lot more questions himself. Until by the end of it, it's not enough for him to just hear some orders and do them. He has to know what the actual situation is. He wants to know the truth before performing an action. That's what these investigation missions are all about. While there's the gameplay perspective of Altair going to these different investigations to get tips on how to perform the final assassination, the more diegetic purpose of this investigation is Altair going about this new city where he is learning from the citizens who live in it exactly what is going on, where the corruption is, where they need help. There are multiple assassination targets who are being targeted by the citizens themselves because of how bad that these people in charge are running things. They're starting revolts. And we have to keep in mind, well, our gameplay perspective is that we climb a tower, we see some point on the map, we click on it to know where to go, and then just wander over to exactly that point. Altair's perspective on it is wandering through the streets until he hears something or sees something and looks into it further. All of his character development comes out of just listening to the people he would have once thought are beneath him. And this becomes especially important when we look at the final bad guys of this game, Robert de Sablé and Al-Mualim. Both of them want to rule by saying their word is final. They will decide exactly how things are going to go in the world. Versus Altair's new outlook, who understands to look to the people and see what it is they want and they need. Altair's journey in this game is one of learning not to try to enforce his own will, but to understand context to better understand how to help as many people as possible. So yeah, from a gameplay perspective, these missions get a little repetitive and they're not as much fun as we get toward the end of the game. But from a narrative perspective, I think they really work in showing how Altair changes from who he is at the beginning of the game to somebody who's able to lead the Order past the end of this game. But hey, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that follow button and maybe check me out at these other places. So I'm replaying the original Assassin's Creed for the first time in probably at least a decade, and one thing's especially hitting me this time, and that's just how much they're giving a diegetic reason for everything that's going on in the game. All the video gamey things have a reason in here for existing. Even your health bar is how synced up you are with Altair. So if you die, it's not that Altair ever died, it's that you just did actions that are so unlike what Altair would ever do, because he would never get stabbed, that, well, you fell out of sync. Now, I'm very early in this replay, so please correct me if there's an explanation for this later, but at least so far, there's no explanation as to why you're collecting flags. And again, everything is given some kind of purpose within here. So I could only imagine that this means to get fully synced up with Altair, you have to collect the flags, because he was just a huge fan of flags. He had a huge flag collection. Anytime he saw any kind of flag, he had to steal it, because he just loves them so much. For its very first tutorial-esque moment, Assassin's Creed 2 makes an adorable choice. It puts you into the position of Ezio as a baby, and teaches you the system of the face buttons, each representing one of his body parts. Now, aside from just being very cute, this is starting us out in a very specific position for Desmond's story in this game. The biggest thing for Assassin's Creed 2 as far as Desmond's story is concerned is him joining the Assassins rather than being held captive by Abstergo. This tiny little moment is to show us where Desmond is at in terms of his assassin abilities. But while Desmond's using the bleeding effect to become an assassin, Ezio has to learn a parallel story, a story of responsibility. And we see this immediately going back to another one of these moments where it's the exact same thing of just telling us which one of the buttons to press to interact with one of our body parts. In this case, instead of doing anything assassin-like, it's using it to kiss. It's worth noting that by the end of Sequence 1, both Desmond and Ezio are characters getting involved in a conspiracy they barely understand, being pushed into being an assassin even though neither truly knows what that means yet. And in both cases, that first leap to become an assassin? Using eagle vision to find and or open a door. The framing device of having Desmond in the present prevents this from just being Ezio's story. It is taking Ezio's story and saying, what does this tell us about Desmond's? Here's another fun Assassin's Creed 2 detail. Let's talk about how much characterization there is for Abstergo and the Assassins in just the level design. Abstergo is where we spent all the present-day sequences in the first game. We don't see it a lot in this game, but we do get into the main room here. As we could see, it's mainly white, it's lit with more cool colors, it's all got this very cold, clinical feeling to it. When you go into your bedroom, you're locked in, it's a cell. Going downstairs, it's not any better. This is office work cubicle hell. Between the fully encased glass cubes and all this cement everywhere, it gives this impression of like a prison meets an office. Everything about how Abstergo is designed gives it this impression that it's a company that puts business first and humane practices, I don't know, if we got time, maybe? Versus going over to where the assassins are hanging out. Immediately, we could see all the much warmer colors in this set, how it's made to look much more homey. The bed is in this open room, just like everything else is, just like everyone working together. There's not walls separating them and locking them into cells. We look at the Animus itself and how it's much more ergonomically designed. Like, this just looks like a comfy chair to sit in, and this looks like I'm about to have an uncomfortable experience in a doctor's office. This is a loft I could imagine living in. This looks like if a human actually chose to live there, they're probably a psychopath. It's in all these choices, the color of the light, the comfort level of the Animus, the openness versus being locked in places, that it's telling us so much about these two groups. Let's talk just a little bit about the introduction of Leonardo da Vinci in Assassin's Creed 2. When Ezio first meets Leonardo, he asks about his paintings, and Leonardo responds saying, yeah, he paints, but he wants to do more for the world. He wants to have purpose. He wants to change the world. And of course, most of the people playing this game are going to know Leonardo da Vinci for the fact that he did contribute so much to art, to science, to technology that was well beyond his time. This moment happens directly after Ezio's mother tells him he's gotta find more to do with his life than just be a slut. When Leonardo questions him about what he's doing with his life, there's the idea that he's going to be a banker like his father, but it's clear Ezio also wants something more. Using a known figure from history rather than just any old character changes this from just setting up a connection between these two to foreshadowing that Ezio is going to find his great purpose as well. Let's talk about the major targets in the first half of Assassin's Creed 2. Specifically these three, the members of the Pazze family. As an important reminder for this, Ezio starts the game with no idea about the Assassins or Templars or anything, but then when his family is killed, he learns that his father was a member of the Assassins. Well, he gets the robes right away. He starts off just looking for revenge, not knowing the deeper implications of any of this. But when his Uncle Mario explains the war going on between these two groups, Ezio's not a part of this. This isn't what he's here for. But when he finds out one specific family is involved in taking out his family, he's willing to go for this. By having all these targets be members of just one family rather than just Templars in general, it's keeping it personal for Ezio. It's making it much closer to a family feud than this massive clash of two giant groups. By the time we get to the third member right here, Ezio's getting more invested into the bigger scope of all this, to the point that even taking him out first requires taking out 4 Templars who work under him. Pushing this idea even further, that it's going from like a family feud to this much bigger thing he's invested in. It's after taking out all 3 of the members of the Pazzi family that we have to go on a long journey through a whole mountain section, then take a boat in order to get to Venice. The world of his targets is expanded not just by going further out from these guys, but literally in a geographical sense, his world is expanding. And it's at this point where Ezio has just made this change from just going after one family to going after the bigger Templar Order that we see Desmond again for the first time since the beginning, and see he's developed a lot of his assassin skills, at least the parkour, not all the combat fun yet. Because just like Ezio, Desmond has made this change in the first half of the game to most of the way to being an assassin. Let's talk about the use of other factions as allies in Assassin's Creed 2. Throughout this entire game, you are helped by the thieves, the courtesans, and the mercenaries. In the first half of the game, we find the leaders of the thieves, the courtesans, and the mercenaries to complete our tasks. In the second half of the game, where we go to Venice, we meet the leaders of the Venetian thieves, courtesans, and mercenaries. These groups are also the ones who teach Ezio all of his skills. The courtesans teach him how to hide in plain sight and how to pickpocket people. The mercenaries teach him how to fight. And then the thieves teach him how to jump higher. It's worth noting at this point that this kind of faction stuff doesn't really exist in the first game. We have scholars and vigilantes, but they're not so much like along with you on this quest or anything. It's this idea that when you save a civilian, other people will be willing to help you. In a story about Altair having to connect to the people he's supposedly supposed to help, this is showing that if you help people, it will actually make your job easier. It is very beneficial for his story. So what does it do to not just change it up to have these specific factions, but then have the reveal that all the leaders are also assassins? In a game driving home the point of personal choice, they bring in 3 factions that are all about making their own choices rather than caring about the law. But it's also worth adding in that Ezio's the only one who really presents all the time as an assassin versus these other groups who present much more like their other groups. It's almost like saying, yeah, all these guys are in the Brotherhood, but they all have their own specific specialties. Ezio, on the other hand, the truest assassin, has to have a combination of everything. I'm still on my Assassin's Creed 2 bullshit. Let's talk about some of the major collectibles in this game. Let's start with the Codex pages, the only collectible that you need to gather in order to beat the game. The Codex pages, practically speaking, have 2 purposes. On one hand, they are a codex written about the history of the assassins. On the other hand, when you use Eagle Vision, they become a map to vaults where you could find pieces of Eden. And as a bit of a bonus, attempting to collect them all has been a job passed down through generations of the Auditore family. Well, Ezio may dress like an assassin, and he's performing the acts of an assassin. He doesn't technically join the Brotherhood until late in the game. While his family has all been members, he never got told about it. This collectible is like a representation of him coming to know his family's history. On a similar note, we could look at the discs you need to get Altair's armor. Each one of these statues and the disc accompanying it is a representation of a major assassin across history and the weapon they used to take out a major target. Once again, this is all representative of Ezio learning the history of this Brotherhood before he's fully a part of it. And connecting both of these ideas is the fact that Desmond in the present day is living through Ezio's life in order to learn to be an assassin. All these things about learning the history of the Brotherhood is doing all this for him as much as it is for Ezio. Then we have what is the least fun to collect, the feathers. We have a couple different things going on here, one of which being that birds, and eagles in particular, are a major symbol in the Assassin's Creed series. Like the special assassin's vision is called Eagle Vision, and Ezio's name means eagle. But in this story, the feathers were something being collected by Ezio's brother, and now that his brother is dead, Only by collecting them all, completing this collection, can you help his mother deal with this loss. I think it's worth noting that in the first game, feathers keep coming into play as something that is used on the victims of the assassin, wiping their blood on the feather as proof of murder. In this game, you are going from city to city, collecting feathers, while you are taking out the targets responsible for your family's death. I think there's a solid argument for collecting these feathers being a kind of symbol for getting your vengeance on all the people responsible. And then there's the one that's interesting for how little the game calls attention to it at all. Like, there's no mission that at some point has somebody telling you, hey, collect these statues, it might be nice for the grounds. Or there's no increase to the income for having collected them all like any of the other collectibles. We have these statues of Roman gods around the villa, and all of the god statues can be found in the greater villa grounds. So you're not even going far. You're not going to all the different cities to collect them. You're just wandering around your neighborhood. And with no other attention being drawn to it, I think it's worth noting, one, that they are all found around this one location, and two, that this is the game that introduces Minerva. Without getting too much into the lore, people in myth that we thought were gods were actually like ancient beings that came before humans. Having you collect these figures and giving little descriptions of them all is giving you a little reminder or a little nudge in the direction of, oh, hey, do you remember Roman gods? It's doing everything it can to be like, hey, we're gonna draw a parallel here later, but we don't want to draw any attention to it at all. And I think the fact that they're placed all around the villa, the place that we're using as our assassin's headquarters, the place that's important enough to the assassins that it has Altair's armor in it. It's like it's saying that the first civilization has this connection to the assassins without outright saying it. Let's talk about fighting the Pope. For the final target of Assassin's Creed 2, Ezio has to take out Rodrigo Borgia, who has just become the Pope. This is a two-section fight that does some pretty great things with both sections. This picture's from the first section of the fight, where we could see Rodrigo, who is the leader of the Templars, at least in this game, has the Staff of Eden. What we don't see is Ezio has the Apple of Eden. Main Templar versus main Assassin, each with their own, basically, magical artifact. So great what they chose to be the pieces of Eden that each of them are holding, because a staff is usually imagery associated with power, versus the apple is usually more freedom, knowledge. Within just their magical artifacts, we're seeing what the Templars and Assassins represent. And then there's how they use these pieces of Eden in the fight, because Rodrigo's go-to move is to just knock everyone out, versus Ezio, who uses the apple to create duplicates of himself. It is one man wanting as much power for himself as possible, and another man who knows to lean on people. But then, soon after this, we move on to the second section of the fight, where they get rid of their pieces of Eden. They drop all their weapons and just fight fist to fist. And this is great because for so much of this game, Ezio is not an assassin. He only becomes an actual member of the Assassins at the end of sequence 11 of 14. And sequences 12 and 13 were actually DLC, so it's like right before this ending he becomes an assassin. At this point, getting rid of all their stuff, it's saying, we are not here just to be these symbols. We are not just the Assassin and the Templar. We are not just freedom and power. We are two men making our own choices and choosing to beat each other down. Which ultimately, freedom of choice, making your own decisions, that's what so much of this game is about. It might be shocking to hear, but Assassin's Creed 2, the game where the final boss fight is against the Pope, has a stance on religion. This game has two figures who give their stance on religion, Sister Theodora of the Assassins, and the Pope, Rodrigo Borgia of the Templars. Sister Theodora, as you might imagine from the name, is a woman of faith. The way she feels is most fit to commune with her religion and show her faith is not one that is supported by the church. So what does she do? Rather than bow down and listen to the way she's told she has to display her faith, rather than take over and make everybody show their faith in the same way she does, she starts her own house of worship and just gives people the option. Our final bad guy, Rodrigo Borgia, is the exact opposite. For one thing, in this final fight, he admits he has no faith. For him, the position of Pope is not one of faith whatsoever. It is a position of power. It is a position to force people to bow down to his will. The idea being, if he's controlling how you have to show faith, he is controlling the people. In this game full of religious iconography that's playing with themes of freedom of choice, the good side is shown to be the side that says if you have faith, you should be able to show it in whatever way feels best to you. The bad side is the side that, regardless of what they think, will tell you exactly how you have to show your faith, or else you're doing it wrong. Obviously, I can't make a bunch of Assassin's Creed 2 videos without at least touching on the essentially side quest of the truth. The gameplay of how you uncover the truth is so perfect for so many of the themes this game is playing with. So much of this game is about uncovering information yourself to be able to make the best choice you can make for yourself. The gameplay of the truth is about finding these glyphs out in the world. Glyphs that are not really on your map, but kind of sort of hinted at on your map if you look at it in relation to the database as well. And then playing through these little puzzles to get a little clip of something. Puzzles that are not overly difficult, but do require some real thought. Additional layer on top of this is explicitly not something Ezio ever did in his lifetime. The idea is this is something in the Animus, something that Desmond could see and could push Ezio into doing. It is player curiosity telling us something about Desmond's curiosity, and more than that, it doesn't grant us any gameplay benefits to complete it all. It's more information, as Desmond is learning more about the Assassin Order. Because what is the truth in the end? It is the origin of the very first assassins, where humans were made by the first civilization thanks to the pieces of Eden, but we were used as slaves. And we see by the way they're animated in their movement, all the parkour and everything they're doing, that these two are the first assassins. These two being Adam and Eve. And if it's not abundantly clear already, at the very end of this sequence, some binary pops up that if you translate it, spells out Eden. In this, the Order of Assassins are being connected to the very first people who ever went against orders to find their own knowledge and make their own choice. Just like all the factions within the Assassins. Let's talk about the placement of the present-day sequences in relation to Ezio's story in Assassin's Creed 2 and see just how much it tells us about Desmond's arc. The first time we see Ezio, he's just a baby. At this point, this is what Desmond is in relation to the Assassin's Brotherhood. He's full of potential, but he has none of the knowledge, none of the skills. He's a blank slate that needs to learn what it means to be an assassin. Ezio then takes out the entire Pazzi family for revenge for the deaths of his family. But he decides to move on to Venice, where there's more going on. It's no longer just about him. Ezio making this choice to go on well beyond the bounds of just revenge for his family coincides with Desmond now having all the parkour skills to be an assassin. Ezio then takes out the Templar Order in Venice, a thing he has no real connection to. He just did it to help the people, and it's only after that that he truly becomes an assassin. When we jump to the present day at this point, just like Ezio, Desmond is fully invested. When they try to pull him out of the Animus, he doesn't want to. He wants to get right back in and see where this is going. It's here that Ezio learns that the Templar plot has always been about finding this vault, and he makes it his own goal to stop them from getting inside. It's at this point, when Ezio has chosen the Order over his own revenge, he lets Rodrigo live because this was just about stopping him from getting the vault, that Desmond comes back and he gets the hidden blade, and is able to kick some serious ass like only an assassin could. I want to talk about the Assassin's Creed 2 DLC sequences, but this is one topic I feel I need to split into two parts. This is going to be the more negative side of it, taking a look at how its presentation really made it so much worse than it should have been. If you don't know, and it's very fair that you don't if you've only ever played this game in the Ezio Collection remasters, the DLC was the sequences 12 and 13. And this is where we immediately get into the problem of the presentation of this DLC. This is a story-based game where you move from sequence 1 to sequence 14, where when you finish 11, someone starts talking and says, oh wait, actually it looks like the part here is corrupted, we're gonna have to skip ahead. So where you already have some people talking about DLC as though the developer chopped off part of a full game and is charging you extra to just get back to having the full game, this game is really making those allegations hard to fight with how they set it up. But then the thing is these two sequences are not only not essential to the story, they kind of break the pacing of it. If you don't have the DLC, if you just go from Sequence 11 to Sequence 14, then the end of Sequence 11 is Ezio has just formally become an assassin. You go to the present day just long enough for Desmond to be like, no, I need to know what happens next, and go right back into the Animus, and then you're into Sequence 14. If you have all the Codex pages already, you're just going off to the final fight immediately. But if you're playing with the DLC there, well, then you're playing through these two sections that have to be inessential to the plot, so they have to basically end at the same place they began, or else it is essential and kind of screws things over for the people who don't have it. And they succeed at this. They are non-essential. They are bonus stories to give Ezio just a little more to do. Don't get me wrong, they are a good time, but because of what they needed to be, they feel like their inclusion, if you're playing just through the main game, feel like it brings it down. With all this, it's worth bringing up the context in which all this came out. The DLC was released in 2010. This was like the early days of it being the norm for games to start getting these expansion DLCs. This honestly might be the first one I ever got. Though as a bit of an aside, just 5 years earlier, I got what would become normal downloadable content later as a disc, with Halo 2's multiplayer map pack. And it's exactly what it sounds like. It's bonus maps for Halo 2, but because my Xbox wasn't connected to the internet, I had to go out and buy a disc to download it onto the console. Anyway, all this is to say, this was still the early days. They were still trying to figure out what DLC should look like, what makes good DLC content. And while what they did were good missions, the presentation was atrocious and brought the whole thing down. But more on what those sequences actually were in the next part. It's time to talk a little more about Assassin's Creed 2's DLC. You could check out my earlier video for part 1, but it was essentially talking about how its presentation, its integration into the game itself was pretty awful and made it look bad. But in this one, where I'm going to talk about the actual content of this DLC and not just how it was put into the game, it's going to be a lot more positive. Let's start with the first one, Sequence 12, where we're in Forli helping Catarina. This entire sequence essentially boils down to saving Catarina's family. And what does this do for Ezio? It gives him a chance to succeed where he failed in the past. While he couldn't save his own family, this is his second shot at that. And it kind of starts the trend as these DLC sequences as a kind of therapy or catharsis for Ezio. By the time we get to Sequence 13, it literally takes us back to his hometown of Florence. What's most interesting with this sequence is it completely changes up how it tells a story within a sequence. For most of the game, you are progressing through linear missions, with only the odd time where maybe there's a couple different missions you could go to at the same time and choose your own order. Sequence 13 instead has a mission at the beginning, a mission at the end, and 9 missions throughout the middle that you could do in any order however you feel like. Where Sequence 12 is Ezio getting to save a family when he couldn't save his own, this one is a microcosm of the Templars' plan. A man has the Apple of Eden and takes over an entire city, but he doesn't have to use the apple to take over all the civilians in order to take over the city. He just needs 9 men. These are men in high up positions in news, art, access to movement within the city, imports, farming, police, religion, healthcare, and nobility. Nobilities seemingly standing in for like celebrity or the rich. The nobleman is even the easiest one out of all these targets, which is probably a fun little commentary on its own. What's especially great is taking out these 9 targets, just making it so the citizens don't have to worry about all these things being restricted is enough to allow them to stand up and fight for themselves. At the very end, while Ezio is technically the one who kills him, the citizens burn him alive, and Ezio just stabs him as a mercy killing. And it's at this point that Ezio gives a big speech about everything about what he's learned in this game in its entirety, about how you shouldn't be just out for revenge, and the importance of getting all the information to be able to make a decision for yourself. I think both of these, in terms of what they do for Ezio's character, and just in terms of having a good time with him, they are great little pieces of DLC that, like I said in the last one, we're just hurt by how it got put into the game. While the first story in Ezio's trilogy is one of choice, of free will, of having the ability to choose to be a part of something bigger than yourself, his second story, Brotherhood, is all about what it means to be a leader. So much of the gameplay in this is all about leadership. We could see this in the new mechanics of how you build your own Assassin's Brotherhood and help them get all the way to being assassins themselves. We could see this in how most of the sequences are about going into one of the factions that are helping you and being someone who could help them in return. But one of the biggest ways this game represents what it deems to be good and bad leadership is the use of these four characters here. Ezio is our main character and made leader of the assassins in this game. Rodrigo Borgia is the leader of the Templars from the prior game who was left alive in the prior game. Machiavelli is essentially Ezio's right-hand man with the assassins. And Cesare Borgia should be like the right-hand man of the Templars, but is making himself the leader in this game. The game starts out with Ezio getting a lot of questions about whether or not Machiavelli could be trusted. This primarily comes down to the fact that Machiavelli doesn't agree with the fact that Ezio left Rodrigo alive in the prior game. While Ezio's choice is being called into question, he chooses a trust but verify approach with Machiavelli, where he's going to trust him, but he's going to join the Thieves Guild in looking into things just to be 100% sure. And ultimately, as much as there's some suspicion thrown Machiavelli's way, he is an incredibly loyal person, and in part because of how good of a leader Ezio is, Machiavelli, he'll doubt this one choice Ezio made, but he's not going to go against him. On the other side of things, Cesare is so against how the entire last game ended that he immediately goes and decides he's going to take out Ezio and his entire family against what Rodrigo tells him. While both of their leaderships are being called into question because of the events of the end of the previous game, only Rodrigo isn't trusted enough to actually keep the loyalty of his people. And while this entire setup establishes Cesare as kind of the Machiavelli of the Templar side of things, he also forces himself into a leadership position, putting him also as a foil to Ezio. And while Ezio was just so good to everyone around him that they put him in the leadership position, we see how Cesare has to steal this position, and how that says so much about the rest of the way he leads things. And ultimately, when it comes down to the final fight between these two leaders, Ezio goes it alone. He has established everything in Rome so strongly that he trusts them to be okay by themselves, and he does not want to take them into danger. Versus Cesare, who is more than willing to throw everybody in front of Ezio's blade to protect himself. The stronger leader inspires loyalty, helps everyone around him, leads with kindness, while the weaker one leads with violence and fear and treats people as though they are just objects for his own use. And when he's stripped of all of his fancy shit, he is nothing. Let's talk a bit about Assassin's Creed Revelations, the final game in the Ezio trilogy of Assassin's Creed games. This is a game that takes the concept of reliving these memories and compares it fairly directly to the idea of enjoying fiction. It's all about taking in these stories. Desmond starts the game unable to live anymore, essentially, because he's so caught up in these stories that aren't finished. He needs to experience the end before he can move on. And then when he gets into being Ezio, we don't have the same tutorial of someone on the outside explaining how to do these things. It's Ezio literally chasing the ghost of Altair. This is the only one of Ezio's games that doesn't have buying paintings as a thing you could do, and instead you are buying novels. And not only this, you have to find novels in order to unlock these keys, these memories, to live Altair's stories. While Desmond is hung up on Ezio's story, Ezio is hung up on Altair's story. As the whole thing progresses, Ezio falls in love with the woman who's helping him interpret this art, but he can't let her in, because he is afraid what his story can do to her. By the time we're getting to the climax and to the end, he has to give up Altair's story in order to save this woman. He has to give up the stories he's enjoying to find his own story. Then as we get to the final mission, it's one that mirrors the first, but this time we're not chasing Altair's ghost. It's Ezio slowly walking these halls with Sophia and explaining to her his story. It is him being able to tell his story instead of just going after someone else's. One of the last things Ezio does is go into a library, slowly lighting each one of the torches as he's getting ready to start telling his own story. And then we go to Altair, who went into this same library and was extinguishing all the torches because he had told his entire story already. This library isn't just a library, it is a mausoleum. It is where the stories, these lives, these people end up. And then we get this very meta line from Ezio.
I have lived my life as best I could, not knowing its purpose, but drawn forward like a moth to a distant moon. And here at last, I discover a strange truth. And I am only a conduit for a message that eludes my understanding. Who are we who have been so blessed to share our stories like this, to speak across centuries? Maybe you will answer all the questions I have asked. Maybe you will be the one to make all this suffering worth something in the end.
This is Ezio almost explicitly stating he knows he's a fictional character and everything in his life, his entire purpose so far, has been to tell a story to help Desmond, the player, experience this story, to help them understand life a little bit more. But this is also right after he's put down all of his assassin's gear, because once again, this is the point where he's decided, I'm done with those stories from the past. I'm ready to tell my own story, to exist for my own purpose, and settle down. And you know what? On a thematic level, as it's talking about memories and stories and lives, this game actually pairs beautifully on a thematic level with what remains of Edith Finch. So I've just started replaying Assassin's Creed 3 for the first time since it came out in like 2012. I'm not too far in, but I have reached the point that I'm playing as Connor now, so I want to talk about the whole twist of how we're playing as Haytham for the first 3 sequences. I feel like this was one of the most maligned aspects of the game when it first came out, but I'm kind of into it. First, there's the fact that it makes us feel closer to the villains than we ever have, at least at this point in an Assassin's Creed game. And going from being the one putting together this group of Templars to having to take them out is a pretty fun little twist. And on top of this, something I don't think I ever thought about the first time I played it, is how the Haytham-Connor relationship is being made to parallel the Desmond and his father relationship. And of course, playing as Haytham in the opening is kind of used to help sympathize us to the character. Now, this all said, there's one thing I think is really cool about this that I have a weird little nitpick about. The whole twist that Haytham is a Templar works on the fact that they never actually say that you're an assassin or a Templar. They just kind of play with expectations in playing this game. You're playing as a character who is performing assassinations, has a hidden blade, is putting together some kind of order, he has the eagle vision, all of this. Everything is set up in a way where it's just a natural assumption to assume he is an assassin. And it's because of this it works when they just pull the rug out from under you and say, no, he's a Templar. But there's one gameplay element that takes this from a deception based off expectations to a little bit of a lie. Let's just zoom in a little bit here and you can see right next to me, these little buddies here marked with the Assassin's logo. And like I said, this is me just being nitpicky. This isn't a serious complaint because this is really just the friendly NPC logo. But the fact that it is the Assassin symbol kind of sets up particular expectations and kind of makes it feel like a little bit of a lie. It doesn't actually mean that much. Even your own horse is labeled with this. It's just a friendly person. But choosing this has meaning. This makes them look like actual assassins. Anyway, that's how I'm feeling about at least the opening of Assassin's Creed 3 on this replay and that tiny little nitpick I had to get off my chest. And I don't know, maybe I'll say more things as I get a little further along. Sometimes it becomes appropriate for a story to ignore something from the past in its series in order to best tell its story. I want to talk about this with a specific example from Assassin's Creed 3. One of the core themes of Assassin's Creed 3 is how Connor is split between 2 worlds. We can see this even in the fact that he has 2 names. Connor isn't actually his name, it's Radun Hagidun. I really hope I'm pronouncing that right. And why does he have 2 names? Well, there's the name he uses when he's with his tribe, and there's the name he uses when he's with the non-indigenous people. But there's an even more obvious split between these 2 situations, and that is the language being used, where he will speak the Mohawk language when he's with his tribe, and he will speak English with literally everyone else. And why this is notable at all is the fact that they made a choice in one of the early present-day moments in Assassin's Creed 1 to say that all language that is going through the Animus is being translated to English so that Desmond could understand what's going on. This still holds true here. They still have this in-universe reason why everyone could have been speaking English the whole time, but they chose not to, and the fact that they made this choice is all the more interesting. They had the perfect out to have everyone speak English, but instead decided to make this choice and ignore that element from the past in order to better demonstrate how he is split between these two worlds. I could probably go on about all the different dualities in this game, about how many times it's going on about being caught between two worlds, but my big point here is sometimes it's okay to ignore lore. What matters is telling the most well-done story on its own. Here's something I love that Assassin's Creed 3 started to bring back to the series for a little while, and that's the kind of blurred lines between good and evil when it comes to the Assassins and the Templars. While Haytham is undoubtedly more brutal and more cynical than Connor ever is, the relationship between the two is a commentary on the relationship between the Assassins and the Templars. It's really showing off that there could be people with good intentions on either side of it. And this just kicks things off because we continue this trend with Assassin's Creed Rogue, where you're of course playing a former assassin turned Templar. Assassins are the bad guys in this game. Black Flag has a kind of similar feeling, but with a very different setup, starting out as a pirate who's on neither side, who's kind of being wooed from one side to the other by happenstance of who he stole an outfit from, until he eventually decides that the Assassins are the side for him. And then, of course, Assassin's Creed Unity, which I think is the last game where we ever see these blurred lines in the dynamic, where we have Arno and Elise, the Assassins and the Templars, having a Romeo and Juliet kind of story. And what's interesting is that this was in the DNA of the series right from the beginning, and I feel like we just kind of left it behind for the Ezio trilogy. Because the biggest thing with the first Assassin's Creed game is the fact that the leader of the Assassins was himself a Templar. The whole game is Altair coming to realize that every one of the Templars have just as just goals as he does, and trying to come to terms with the fact that if they want all the same things we want, why are we the good guys and they're the bad guys? And in the end, they're saying that it's because Assassins want freedom and Templars want control. But even in that game, the guy who's been leading the Assassins the whole time wants that control. The Assassin's Creed series as a whole is definitely saying Assassins are the good guys and Templars are the bad guys. And yeah, I think it's very easy to agree with that. Freedom over control, for sure. But these games where they play with that relationship can be incredibly interesting, and I love that Assassin's Creed 3 brought that back. Let's talk a little bit about the major themes in the Desmond era of Assassin's Creed games and what they tell us about Desmond's story. If you're on the side of making society better, you have to listen to the people in society, not see yourself above them. Part of having freedom of choice, of having free will, is having access to information to make an educated choice. To build a foundation that lasts, it is better to lead with kindness and loyalty than with fear. Finishing a story can be incredibly valuable in teaching you about the world, but eventually you have to put it down and tell your own story. Creating a new society means destroying an old one, and as long as there are people who are only out for their own power, it'll always revert to the same need to fight for freedom. Now, these themes are primarily built from the perspectives from the stories of Altair, Ezio, and Connor, but what happens when we look instead at how they're all affecting Desmond? Desmond is kidnapped and shown something bigger than himself, using this story of being amongst the people to show him the bigger players that have been working behind the scenes through all of history. But looking into the past of the Assassin's Brotherhood teaches him this is where he wants to be. He tries to be a huge part of this team, but it leads him to doing something he's not really sure he wanted to do. But looking back on the stories of others helps reinforce exactly why he's doing what he's doing, as well as helps him come to terms with his own story. And finally, Desmond gets the choice to either hit the reset button on humanity, destroying basically all of society, to start it over with himself as the one setting the ideals of what society should be, or sacrificing himself in order to let society keep trying. He sacrifices himself. Back to the lessons he learned in the first game. You have to be a part of the people, not put yourself above them, and the lessons of this game, that if society resets, it's just going to be the same fights for power of people twisting these ideals to their own personal gain. It's better to let the people who are fighting keep fighting than to start it all from fresh, destroying everything kind of for nothing. I just finished playing Assassin's Creed Liberation for the first time, and now I gotta talk about what I think is the coolest thing in this game. First, let's get some Assassin's Creed backstory out of the way, because in the first 5 games in the modern day we are playing as a character named Desmond Miles, who is going into the Animus to relive the memories of his ancestors. In the most recent 3 Assassin's Creed games, instead we have Layla Hassan as the modern day character, and it doesn't seem like she's going back into her ancestors' memories so much as the memories of those she's finding DNA for. But there's a lot of games that come out between the first 5 and the last 3, and that's Rogue, Black Flag, Unity, Syndicate. And, well, this one here, Liberation. And what's interesting is for the most part, these games still have those modern day segments, except for the most part, we're playing as an unnamed character and playing in first person. We are someone in this game. And again, for the most part, these unnamed characters who we are embodying are like QA testers at Abstergo Entertainment who are essentially play testing these memories to turn them into games for the public. Now, why all that matters for me talking about Assassin's Creed Liberation? This game doesn't actually have the modern day sequences, but it is still treated as though it is developed in the same way as those games without modern day characters. The whole deal is, rather than this be one where you are like an unnamed QA tester going through and just experiencing the story, this is that you have purchased something from Abstergo Entertainment. We are playing the game that came out of Abstergo. And here's the thing that makes that very cool. The other games have the fact that you are directly playing from someone's memory, so they're completely unedited and everything. But this game is edited. It is made for the public and altered because of this. But this game has these Citizen E missions, which is essentially a hacker got into the game and is showing you the extended cutscenes that Abstergo doesn't want you to see. These extended scenes, when put back into their context, essentially change it from being a story about how an assassin decided no, joining the Templars is good actually, to a story about how an assassin is kind of conflicted a little bit and then ultimately decides no, the assassins are the right ones. This is true in every one of the extended scenes. They're primarily cutting things that make the Templars look worse, but it's especially true in the very end, where we get one ending where Aveline, the assassin we're following this whole time, joins the assassins, but then Citizen E unlocks the true ending, which happens right after that, where Aveline is like, no, this was all a trick, now I'm gonna kill you. This is just a very cool use of this framing device that is there in all of the games, and just slightly tweaking it a little to do something very different. Because it came with Assassin's Creed 3 Remastered, I am currently playing Assassin's Creed Liberation for the first time. And I'm not very far in, about an hour through the first sequence, and there's a comparison I can't help but make. I know other things have probably done this whole 3-persona kind of system, but doing this with Assassin's Creed Liberation and Adeline, I cannot help but compare it to Mark Spector and Moon Knight. There's the assassin persona, which is of course most comparable to Mark Spector himself, the mercenary. There's the slave outfit for when she's trying to go through lower class situations without raising suspicion, just like Jake Lockley, the cab driver. And there's the high class outfit, just like Stephen Grant, the millionaire who could talk to all the rich folk. Just a fun little comparison I started to think about the moment they added these different outfits to the game. I've been talking a bunch about Assassin's Creed Black Flag lately, and today's apparently its 9-year anniversary, so it's time to talk about it some more. Though a little fun fact, when I went to confirm this on Google, Assassin's Creed Black Flag, you can see it all over the place, it says that. Connor, what are you doing here? The thing I kind of want to talk about today is the Abstergo in the present day, and how it aged poorly. So there's always been the present day missions in Assassin's Creed games, except for sort of in Syndicate where they're not really missions so much as cutscenes. But in at least Black Flag and possibly Rogue and Unity, I honestly don't remember the present day stuff so much, you are an Abstergo employee working at their video game studio and going into the past to get shit for their game. And of course, from all the past games and how this game develops, we know that Abstergo is the Templars, the bad guys of this entire series. And now, why I say this aged poorly is because, jump forward to, I believe it was 2020, and all the reports of how absolutely terrible it was for so many people working at Ubisoft, where there was just a toxic work environment, especially in regards to sexism and sexual harassment. And to have all this come out about a studio who just a few years before put out a game where a video game studio that is very clearly modeled after them is the bad guys of the series, well, that just feels like a purposeful joke. Like someone must have known, right? I want to talk about one of the major themes in Assassin's Creed Unity, especially as presented in Arno's final narration. It basically comes down to this idea that it's better to be able to look at the world around you and make decisions for yourself about what is best for any situation, rather than looking to some system of ideals to decide for you. And the way this is mostly approached in this game is through looking at the groups of the Assassins and the Templars and focusing in on these figures so stuck in the past and the way they believe these groups need to be, that they're losing out on what it could be. This is shown in the assassins through Belek, who kills their mentor, the one in charge of this group of assassins, because he is so set on the possibility that they could maybe, potentially, have peace with the Templars. Similarly, the final bad guy in this game, Germain, is so caught up in what the Templars used to be that he is killing the people in charge of the Templars in order to bring it back to that. And then there's the central relationship in this game between Arno and Elise, which isn't just looking at people as these groups, as these ideals, but looking at them as people and deciding based on that they can still love each other even though they are an assassin and a Templar. Essentially saying any system built on this idea that it could only be done one way and no other options are available, even if this means excluding tons of people. Maybe rethink it a little bit.
The creed of the Assassin Brotherhood teaches us that nothing is forbidden to us. Once, I thought that meant we were free to do as we would, to pursue our ideals no matter the cost. I understand now. Not a grant of permission, the creed is a warning. Ideals too easily give way to dogma. Dogma becomes fanaticism. No higher power sits in judgment of us. No supreme being watches to punish us for our sins. In the end, only we ourselves can guard against our obsessions. Only we can decide whether the road we walk carries too high a toll. We believe ourselves redeemers, avengers, saviors. We make war on those who oppose us, and they in turn make war on us. We dream of leaving our stamp upon the world. Even as we give our lives in a conflict that will be recorded in no history book. All that we do, all that we are, begins and ends with ourselves.
I also just love that this is exactly what went on in the first Assassin's Creed game, where it comes down to the protagonist having to realize, oh, nothing is true, everything is permitted, doesn't mean I could do anything. It actually means that when people say this is a law, maybe I should think about that a little bit more. Assassin's Creed Rogue probably has the most insane set piece of any Assassin's Creed game, at least to my recollection. What I'm talking about is, of course, the mission where you go to Lisbon, Portugal, and you experience the 1755 Lisbon earthquake. You're doing the usual Assassin's Creed parkouring all over these buildings, but they're not stationary because they are all coming down around you. This was absolutely crazy, and having Shay feeling like he caused this, being the reason why he leaves the Assassins, is definitely the most memorable thing in this game. I want to talk about what Assassin's Creed Rogue seems to be saying about media literacy, especially when it comes to stories around real life. The important context here, if you haven't played the game, during the modern day sections of the game, we are working for Abstergo Entertainment, who we know are the Templars, who we know from the past games are the bad guys. We are working for an entertainment company that is trying to use the past to get people on their side about something. We're seeing examples of this as we look at emails on tablets we find around the offices, as well as hacking computers for even more information. A large chunk of the information you get here is either about how good past Templars have been, or talking about assassins who have left the Assassin's Brotherhood to join the Templars. I draw a lot of attention to specifically Berg, the Master Templar at this place, and his inspirational figures from history. These include Al-Mu'allin, Baptist, Duncan Walpole, Haytham Kenway, and Daniel Cross, as well as Shay, the main character in this game. And here's the deal, all of these figures are assassins, either who betrayed the Brotherhood to join the Templars, or who had the same kind of ideals as the Templars while not technically being Templars. And then, of course, the whole narrative of this game is living through Shay's history so that it could be uploaded to the Assassins databases so all the Assassins could see Shay, this exemplar figure of an assassin who decided it would be better to be a Templar. And now getting back to how I started this, wanting to talk about media literacy, I think there are two ways we could take all this information. One of them is completely at face value. Maybe the Templars are right. Maybe the Assassins are bad. Maybe all of these Assassins who have decided to join the Templars are onto something, and all the Assassins should. But especially if you've played a single other Assassin's Creed game, I don't know how you get fully on board with this. The other way to look at it is that it is this entertainment media company looking to the past for the tiny little handful of examples that help their case when there are hundreds and hundreds and thousands of people who are counterexamples that would prove their case wrong. It is this media conglomerate clinging to these couple people who it's like, see, these guys are showing that we're right and you're wrong. But you're clinging to these tiny little things. And again, we see this in these emails that are talking up the Templars and how they're talking around events that happened in the past games that we know happened one way, but they're trying to sell them as happening the other way to make the Templars look good. I would argue the purpose of this entire game is to have second thoughts about everything you see in the media, especially when it's trying to herald this one perfect person as an example as to why their side is right. Because in the end, of course, there's the context from all the other games, where the Assassins and Templars both want the same thing. They both want peace. But Assassins want it through freedom, and Templars want it through their own power, their own control. There were 2 times in a relatively short period that Assassin's Creed put out 2 games on the exact same day. On October 30th, 2012, Assassin's Creed 3 was released for the Xbox 360 and PS3, while Assassin's Creed 3 Liberation was released for the PS Vita. 2 years later, on November 11th, 2014, Assassin's Creed Rogue was released for the Xbox 360 and PS3, while Assassin's Creed Unity was released for the Xbox One and PS4. And just because it was right in the middle of these 2 sets of games, I'll mention Assassin's Creed Black Flag came out October 29th, 2013. It was 5 games in just a couple weeks more than 2 years. Anyway, I bring this up not just because of the astoundment of having so many games released so quickly, but to talk about what these 2 games have in common. Assassin's Creed Rogue and Assassin's Creed Liberation are an interesting pair not just because they were the less marketed side game released at the same time as a main game, but also because they are both stories about the temptation to go to the Templar side. Rogue not only having Shay fully going over to the side of the Templar, but having the modern day unnamed character do the same. And Liberation kind of telling the story of an assassin turning into a Templar, but of course I've talked about this before, if you look at all the Citizen E missions, that's not really what's happening. And looking at these simultaneous releases this way, as games that are more focused on the Templars, but take place around the same time as the games that were released alongside them, that's kind of interesting, right? It almost becomes like a Pokemon Red and Blue situation, but where that just has a couple different Pokemon that could be exclusive in each, this is completely different stories that just happen to be taking place around the same eras, so they could use a lot of the same assets to make both games. And of course, while this is a terrible, terrible business model, it splits the audience. I know myself, I took forever to play either of these games because I just played the games that I felt were the main games, the marketed games, the ones you were supposed to play. And to build out 2 full games all the time and then split the audience, it's kind of an insane move. But as insane as a move it is, as much as it took me forever to finally get around to playing these games for the first time, I didn't pick them up as soon as they came out. I'm glad they exist. It shows something really cool that can be done in these worlds when you're not so focused on only pushing one story and you're actually trying to find the side areas to go. The Assassin's Creed games Rogue and Unity were released on the same day so that the then current and previous gen consoles could each have a release of their own, and they were given one scene shared between them. One of the very late scenes in Rogue has Shay killing an assassin. Then we see a different perspective on that same scene in Unity, where it turns out that assassin is Arno's father. There isn't really another direct connection between the two. Shay isn't exactly hunting the Dorian family the whole time, and Arno never goes after Shay. So is there anything interesting we could see in this scene? And obviously we got the fact that it's just connecting them in the same universe, but I think we could go beyond that. Let's talk about Rogue a little bit. The game where Shay is an assassin who is sent out on a mission that ends up in the deaths of a lot of civilians. And he's not happy about it, for obvious reasons. We could view his game, at least in part, as one man seeing that every member of an organization has gotten so focused on this idea of a mission that they've lost track of any of the things that should matter, like the people they are supposedly protecting. He's seeing a group going in the wrong direction and choosing to take them out because of it. Jumping over to Unity, we have Arno joining the Assassins at a time where both the Assassins and Templars seem to be looking for some kind of change. There are members in each group that are killed by people in their respective group for wanting to allow this change, because there are some people who believe change shouldn't be allowed, they have to stick with their old ways. Basically, in both of these, we're seeing these ideas that what is bad in their worlds, in their times, are people who are so focused on what their group should be that they've lost track of other people and caring about other people. And between them, we see one person reacting to this by saying, we should destroy what's gone bad, and the other person being a symbol of change. The shared scene between these two games is a rather surface level connection if we're just looking at them both in terms of plot. But going past plot into what these games are saying, they become these very interesting companion pieces to one another, where that shared scene is trying to push you to think about them as a singular unit, instead of two completely disparate games, like most of the Assassin's Creed games could be seen as. How bi is Jacob Frye? This is the main question that was on my mind while going into my streamed replay of Assassin's Creed Syndicate. An important note, this isn't about quantifying bi-ness, but about quantifying just how explicit it is in the text that he is bi. And this whole particular exercise in how to look at this game comes out of the fact that the lead writer of the game has gone on and explicitly said outside of the game that Jacob Frye is bi. The main time Jacob's sexuality ever comes into play is in sequence 8, when he's around Maxwell Roth. This whole sequence is notable for a few reasons, including the gameplay one of how you can open up segments of sequence 8 before you actually reach that in the main story. If you choose to do that, then Jacob is building a slow relationship with Maxwell throughout a large portion of the game, versus if you play it all together as just sequence 8 after you've completed 7, it's a rather short-lived thing. There is definite chemistry between Maxwell and Jacob. We could see it in just the way Jacob's face lights up whenever they're going on missions together. And that's the other important point, that they go on these missions together. Well, most of the time the missions in Assassin's Creed come down to you being given a mission, you go off and do it, and maybe you return to the person afterward. Maxwell's different in that he is always coming with you. He may not be participating in every action, but he is there. These are all treated like dates. While it's never explicitly stated this way, and that's important, they are like dates. Building on this is even in their final mission where they are working together, the one that's essentially their breakup, you are awarded with the Copper Love brass knuckles in this mission. The word love coming up as a reward for a mission with Maxwell, that is not a coincidence. And finally, there's the climax of their relationship right after Jacob has assassinated him. Maxwell Roth is talking about just doing things to do them, to have done them, to stir chaos, and he kisses Jacob, and Jacob has a look of disgust. And this is a complicated moment, because everything surrounding the moment is seemingly setting up that Maxwell doesn't feel anything. He is just chaos incarnate, he doesn't have feelings. But from everything before it, it seems like this is something he's been building to for a while. It's not just random, it's not just chaos, it's that he's been wanting to kiss Jacob. And then Jacob's reaction. We could see it as disgust that a man has kissed him, or we could see it as disgust that this figure he had feelings for, that he was actually hurt by, that he has now had to kill, is kissing him now. And it's in this ambiguity that the problems arise in the question of how bi is Jacob Frye. You see, Jacob only has one canon relationship that we ever know about. We don't know who it's with exactly, but we do know he has a granddaughter. Because of this fact, because we know he ends up at least sleeping with a woman once, it is easier to assume he is straight than anything else. Especially when all the moments of him with another man are set up as ambiguously as possible so that you could read it either way. And here's where we get to a complicated point in characters being bisexual or pansexual in media. How often do you actually get the chance to have a character have multiple love interests? And if they aren't having multiple love interests, how are you showing that somebody is interested in multiple genders? There is a reading of this that says, yes, he had a thing with Maxwell, and then he ends up having a granddaughter at some point. Therefore, he had a male love interest, and he at some point later had a female love interest. And that is painting that story, but without anything explicit about his interest in Maxwell, without pushing that story just a little further, a little bit more out of subtext. It's easy to just pass it off as, oh no, anything you might have been seeing there was just like, no, that's in your head, you're reading into it too much, and he's actually straight. And this is where the importance of words come in. And here's the thing, I'm not saying that Jacob at some point in the game had to stop everything and say, guys, I'm bisexual, just so you know! For one thing, in the 1800s when this game took place, it isn't going to be in their vocabulary. He's not going to call himself bisexual. But they did have a means through which to put this in the game. The diegetic explanation for the database entries within the game to give you extra insight into people, places, things going on within the game itself is set up as though it is Rebecca and Sean in the present day, seemingly 2015 when the game was released, writing these themselves. Which means they are at a modern point. They have these terms. They have Jacob's entire history, both before the game and after the game, at their fingertips and could tell us anything. And they still don't use the word. And basically the conclusion here is, yes, Jacob Frye is bi. They say he is bi outside of the game, therefore he is. But reading into what is in the text itself, it is there, but in a way that it is very evident that they wanted you to be able to ignore it if you don't want to see it. And as much as it is exciting how much it is there, it is such a bummer that they don't go the extra step to really say it is really there. I want to talk a little bit more about the 12-issue run of Assassin's Creed Uprising. And just to call it out, because Ubisoft is usually so terrible for actually having any kind of representation, especially for women and queer people, I'm going to point out right there, Charlotte de la Cruz right below me is the main character, and this man next to me is gay. So that's awesome. And he's also married. That's great. I'm happy for him. This book does some interesting things with the relationship between the Assassin's Brotherhood and the Templar Order, especially because of the fact that they gave the Assassins a new bad guy, one they have to work together with the Templars to defeat. And not only do they have to work with the Templars to defeat this bad guy's group is made up of both Assassins and Templars. This group is the instruments of the First Will, basically people doing Juno's bidding so that they could bring her back as their goddess. But they use their short time in the past to make a point about this team up. In this book, they don't spend a lot of time in the Animus, but when they do, they go to the Spanish Civil War. Before I talk about this, I'm going to say, I know this is going to be oversimplifying what the Spanish Civil War was, but this is how the book is oversimplifying it. I'm just repeating what it's saying. They are essentially boiling this war down to the anarchists and the communists versus the fascists. Of course, transferring this to the analogy of our current day players, we have the anarchists in the Assassin's Brotherhood, the communists in the Templar Order, and the fascists in the Order of the First Will. They reinforce this comparison by having them have a conversation about how the assassins are just going for the rights of the people, having them have complete freedom in order to evolve in the way they so choose, and then having the Templars on the side of just giving them a little nudge in technology and everything to push them into evolving into the way they should. Now, while there's some evidence that could push the Templars in this direction from some of the games, I don't think this fully works with everything we know, but I think it works for a cool story here. But the thing is even when they have the Assassins teaming up with the Templars, it's one Templar, and he has made a very specific exception. Right here we have the Black Cross, the guy in the black, who is Otto Berg from some of the present-day sequences of the game, up against a guy who looks like a high-tech assassin, but is actually a member of the Instruments of the First Will, who is essentially a guy trained to be an assassin who is using Templar technology. And here's the thing with the Black Cross. The Black Cross is essentially a mantle that goes to kind of like the internal affairs of the Templars. This is a self-appointed role where they are going through to take out the bad Templars. And so the two times in these books, in both the past and the present, where we see a Templar person teaming up with the Assassins, it is this Black Cross person. It is the person in the Templars who is most likely to see through all the bullshit. Having the Black Cross be the only one who could ever join up with the Assassins, they're kind of saying, like, the idealized version of the Templars can be good, but there's a lot of ways to make it bad, and that's why they need the Black Cross. Let's see if I can summarize the entire history of Juno from the Assassin's Creed series in 3 minutes or less. The first time we hear anything to do with the first civilization, later known as the Isu, is in Assassin's Creed 2. This is still one of the coolest scenes to happen in Assassin's Creed, where it looks like this first civilization person, Minerva, is talking to Ezio, only for her to look up at the camera where she's talking to Desmond or us. We learn the first civilization was an advanced race, they created the humans, and then a celestial event took them out. Brotherhood gives us Juno's introduction when Desmond starts hearing her voice as he touches the Apple of Eden. She uses her powers to force Desmond to kill Lucy. But in AC3, it's somewhat retconned into saying that she gave him premonitions of the future, Lucy was a triple agent, and he kind of wanted to kill her. Compilation introduces Jupiter, the third member of this triad of First Civilization scientists. Juno gives Desmond the location of a First Civilization temple that should stop the Great Calamity, this celestial event, from taking out the humans now. AC3 takes place in 2012, so of course it is about stopping the apocalypse. Juno is telling Desmond that if he uses this temple, he could stop it, but Minerva pops in right at the last minute to say no, this temple is also keeping Juno in check. She is trapped in here. If Desmond uses this temple, it will save them from the solar flare, but it'll also kill him and unleash Juno, who will destroy the humans. Desmond decides the human race stands a better chance against Juno than they do against the solar flare, so he goes through with it, sacrificing himself. It is also revealed that Juno had a husband who she experimented on in the past while trying to find a way to get past these solar flares. This becomes important in Black Flag, where it turns out that husband, because of these experiments, keeps coming back reincarnated into human bodies. These human bodies are known as sages and eventually get all of his memories alongside their own, causing many of them to go insane. And in the modern day section of this game, we learned that one of the sages is trying to use our unnamed player character to bring back his wife Juno, to give her a body. Because of course, when Desmond unleashed her, she didn't have a body, she just kind of existed in the cloud, in the internet, and she needs a new host. Unity reveals that the Templars are looking for these sages because of their special triple helix DNA for something called the Phoenix Project. Syndicate has everybody looking for a piece of Eden called the Shroud, which has healing properties and could be incredibly important to Project Phoenix. And the World War I section has Juno saying she will be coming, so we better be ready, and has us looking for what happened to one of the sages, one of the versions of her husband. But that's the end of this story in the video games. It doesn't come up in the next 3, where they switch gears to being more RPG-ish. Instead, the story is finished in Assassin's Creed Uprising, a 12-issue comic book series. Basically, now there's not just Assassins and Templars, there is the Instruments of the First Will, a third group who are actually made up of Assassins and Templars who are now working to resurrect Juno to take over the world. They see her as a god, they worship her, they want her back. They use the newest sage, who is actually Desmond Miles' son, and then use the Shroud to create a new body for her that will grow extra quickly, bringing Juno back. A group of assassins team up with Otto Berg, a Templar from some of the modern day sections in the game, to defeat her, and that's that. And I think I have just enough time to show you this panel with no context of Juno having a body meeting Charlotte de la Cruz, the main assassin. I'm replaying Assassin's Creed Origins, and this means this is my first time playing the game since the news broke that it was supposed to be Aya who was the main character through most of the game. From what I could find, the most detailed reports just said, early in the game, Bayek was supposed to die and you start playing as Aya for the rest of it. Obviously, getting into this replay, this was one of the biggest things on my mind. I wanted to see, can we see the seams of where that shift was supposed to happen? And it turns out, yeah, the seams are pretty damn obvious when you know what you're looking for. The first chunk of the story has you playing as Bayek with 5 targets you need to take out. The first one is taken out in a cutscene, so that's done. The first little bit of playtime, you get through the second guy, and then by the time you go to Alexandria, where you're gonna take on the third, Aya shows up and says, yeah, I took out the other 2. So this is the last guy on your list to get revenge on. Basically, you take out this 5th guy, and Layla Hassan gets kind of booted from the Animus, starts seeing Aya there, and is brought to where her remains are, so her DNA could be put in the Animus, so theoretically, Layla could go into Aya's mind too. And it's only after this that Bayek and Aya have to go meet Cleopatra and find out about the other members of the Order that need to be taken out. And Bayek takes off his Magi badge to get a new one. It kinda feels like that could have been Aya getting a Magi badge right there instead of just replacing one that already exists. Now I have no guesses on exactly how he would have died, but knowing he was meant to, it's like, yeah, there's still quite a bit in here that feels like it could have happened right here and made a lot of sense. Bayek is completing what he believed the mission to be. Bayek was actually the one literally responsible for the death of their son. Of course he would die. Then it's about continuing on the mission based off Aya knowing people. So yeah, it makes sense that following her lead, we would be her. And Layla Hassan now has her DNA, so of course that's when she would start being her. Also, the first time I played this, I wasn't into photo mode at that point, so I'm having a really good time with this. I am taking so much longer to play this game than I probably should be. I just keep wanting to stop and take pictures rather than do any of the missions. The photo mode in Odyssey is much better, but this is still a lot of fun to play with. Wherever you have long-form storytelling, you're bound to have these elements that are like microcosms of what this story is trying to say. They might be like an event, a character. If it's a TV show, maybe an episode. If it's a video game, maybe a side quest. Right now, this is mostly in my mind because of Odessa, a descendant of Odysseus, and a character you meet very early on in Assassin's Creed Odyssey and have a few quests around her. This is a character who sees her lineage, sees her namesake, and thinks the way to live up to Odysseus is to essentially follow exactly in his footsteps. When we meet up with her again, she's on a farm where she's essentially living her father's life, taking care of this place because her father can't do it. What keeps coming up with her is she is living her life around what her family has done rather than craft her own story. And of course, what all of Odyssey is about going on this epic adventure to craft your own story, to have a legend built around you. So of course, where this all ends up is screw what anyone else has done. Let's go on our own Odyssey and create legends for our descendants to be talking about and have some fun while we're at it. It's also just fun that, while Origins is the game that started the RPG trilogy of Assassin's Creed in how so much of it is built and how it shifted away from the classic style, it's this game that adds so much more to personal choice and essentially crafted its entire story about building your own story. I've started a replay of Assassin's Creed Valhalla, something I am bound to regret at some point because this is an incredibly long game, but right now I'm having a lot of fun and really want to talk about it now that I'm about at the end of the first arc. Valhalla, for obvious reasons, is dealing a lot with Norse mythology. We see it very evidently in the fact that you're playing as Odin through sections of it. A big thing in Norse mythology is things like cycles, death, rebirth, Ragnarok. While I noticed this in the major story for the entire game by the end of the first playthrough, what I didn't notice is how much this is woven in just to that first arc too, to make sure you're getting these themes right at the beginning. We start the game essentially living cycles in Ivor's life, starting at a point where we are at her family's home, where it is invaded and her parents die. Then when we jump to Ivor in the future, it is when she returns to that home, when she's getting revenge on the person who killed her family, all of this. When we look at the idea of Ragnarok and how it's the death of the gods and the rebirth of them in the form of new gods who are going to take over for Odin and all of them, well, we have the fact that Sigurd's dad bends the knee. He is no longer going to be in power. Sigurd, Ivor, all of the people of that generation decide, you know what, we're out. We're gonna go where we could have the power. Not an exact one-for-one with Ragnarok, but it's definitely leaning in that direction. Now, there's a very cool use of cycles in this story on its own, but because I just recently replayed a bunch of the Assassin's Creed games, it goes deeper in ways I definitely didn't notice before. Valhalla is, of course, the third game in Layla Hassan's ancient RPG trilogy of Assassin's Creed games. If we look at the end of another trilogy with the Ezio trilogy, we could see some interesting stuff, especially when we look at the fact that Revelations, the end of that trilogy, is a game about Desmond going back to be Ezio, who is trying to figure out what's going on with Altair, where in this we have Layla going back to be Ivor, finding out what's going on with Odin. That's just like the tiniest detail that's pushing this even further. We have the fact that Basim specifically met Sigurd at Constantinople, of course the place where Revelations takes place. But Ezio's trilogy isn't the only trilogy that is arguably going on with Desmond. We also have his entire series, which is arguably a trilogy if we're just counting numbered titles or different assassins, or a pentology if we're counting all of the games because Ezio got 3 of them. But either way, if we look at the end of his series there, we're also getting some interesting things with Valhalla. There's a section later on in Valhalla where you literally visit where Assassin's Creed 3 took place. It's literally the vault where all the stuff was going down there. There's also the fact that Assassin's Creed 3 is the one where Desmond makes the big heroic sacrifice and everything, and this is the one where Layla, I don't remember exactly if she chooses to sacrifice herself or if she's tricked. It's been a while since I played it, but either way, this is the one where she's taken out, and guess what? Who do we see when that happens? A pure data version of Desmond. And we look at this, we look at how it's playing with these ends of series games, how it's playing with Desmond and Layla. It is doing another giant cycle. It is turning Desmond's story and Layla's story into another one of these cycles that is repeating itself. And going probably too deep down the rabbit hole, going outside of the purview of Valhalla, it's interesting with this idea of cycles to look at Mirage and how Mirage is like the anti-Assassin's Creed 1 in terms of themes. It's Basim learning the exact opposite thing as Altair did. And of course, if we look at Valhalla and Mirage together, Bassam is a character from the past who came back to the present instead of being like Desmond, who was somebody in the present who looked back on the past. I wanted to get some work done today, and then I seem to have kind of turned into this when I started playing Valhalla. I want to talk about a series of fantastic little details in Assassin's Creed Mirage. This game is primarily about Bassam's desire to be more than just a man, to be this epic hero. It's even brought up in the game in reference to him wanting to be like Gilgamesh, which is a reference to the Mesopotamian myth that is recounted in the Epic of Gilgamesh. This reference is doubled down on when he gets his eagle, whose name is Enkidu, which is a character who becomes Gilgamesh's closest friend in the story. But when we reach the end of the game, when he's unlocked his past life as Loki, he's attacked by Enkidu. This tiny little moment in a cutscene is telling us as much as he wished to be more than a man, while he was a man, he was a hero worthy of the name Gilgamesh. But now that he's a god, he's something much worse. Assassin's Creed Mirage is a fun game, but so many of the things I find the most interesting about it are how it relates to the original Altair's Assassin's Creed from 2007. There are very surface level things, like the similarities in the architecture and the design aesthetics going on between the two. There's even a trophy for saving up until you have 2007 dirhams because the first game was released in 2007. But where the depth really starts to come in is when you start looking at how their stories compare. Because interestingly enough, these two games on a plot level are pretty similar, with one just being updated in how the gameplay goes, but telling completely opposite stories. Both games start out with you finding an ancient artifact, well, going against a lot of what you were just told by the assassins. You go back to the city where they're trained, and now you gotta start at the bottom of the assassin ladder. You end up being told you have a specific number of targets, but you have to go to the specific assassins bureaus, where they will give you clues as to what neighborhoods and stuff to check out, to get to know what's going on around the town, and really understand who it is you're going up against. As you progress further in these investigations, some questions start to come up of, should you be killing these people specifically, especially without asking even more questions? You take out the final Templar/Order member, and you find out that the leader of the assassins has been hiding something from you the whole time. Something ancient, back at Assassin's HQ. You go back, you have to fight the Master Assassin, and then you get whatever the ancient thing is. But here's the thing, the original game was about an arrogant asshole who had to learn to humble himself, who had to go and see what life was like for the people on the street to truly understand why he was doing the things he was doing. It was about a guy who thought he was the greatest, who had to learn he was just a person. Get to Mirage, and it is about a guy who knows he's just a normal guy, but more so than anything, he wants to be this great hero. By the end of the game, he's treated like this chosen one, the only one who could open the door, and even the Master of the Assassins is like, hey, if you don't do that, you could be here as just a man, but that should be enough. But it's not enough for him. He needs to be on top. And what's even better, the entire time he's learning the exact opposite lesson he should, the exact opposite lesson of Altair, the game is telling us this. He's being haunted by a genie, which should immediately bring to everyone's mind the concept of, be careful what you wish for. He wishes the entire game to be this great hero, and at the end, he makes the choices to make himself this, and loses himself entirely. Well, I think Mirage has a story that could totally stand on its own. I think the way it uses the first Assassin's Creed game makes it just so much more interesting if you have that direct comparison to make.